here. Before we do, I'm going to ask my grandpa to lead us in a prayer. Sorry.
Father, my great God, Creator and Master, thank you for letting us be here this day, and thank you for the opportunity to study your word. Be with Adam as he directs our study, helping to remember the things he's prepared. We pray that it will all be to your honor and your glory, and to the glory of our Savior, Jesus Christ. It's in his name we pray. Amen.
Okay, so good morning. Today's kind of class structure is we're going to be looking at Jesus' prediction, the ruler's plot, and then Judas' bargaining for Jesus' death. So it seems like from the title there's always like a lot to cover here, but my actual like verse context, it's going to be like roughly 8 or 9, maybe 10. But the Matthew, Mark, and Luke account, they all have the same for the plotting of Jesus' death. So we're actually going to skip to Luke, and we'll just do, or for the last, that'll be the last section, but we'll only look at the last 3 verses in Luke. Just a warning. So no promises I'll be up here for the full time, which might be a sigh of relief for some of you. But we'll get started here. And I think when we read through this, especially the first kind of 2 sections we're going to look at, you'll see as we read the actual verses, this is more of not necessarily a lesson by Christ, but more of this transitional period in his life where we're going to be seeing, it's an exciting time, obviously, because this is now past Jesus' last moments, per se, and we're going to see that switch into now the end of God's plan here, and we're going to go to his arrest and then his ultimate death and resurrection. And so we're kind of getting to the climax, the peak of what we've been looking at here for I don't know how many months now, but in the fourfold gospel. So that's just an exciting time as we're kind of finally wrapping it up, but getting to like the most important part, and that'll be Jesus' death, obviously. So just to start, I want to do a little bit of context. It's not like my normal context of necessarily an order of the time being, but I want to look at kind of the reasons why we've gotten to this point where the Jewish leaders at the time have decided that they can't do anything about Christ, so they have to kill him. And of course, there's even more reasons than I could list, to be honest, but I think I've tried to wrap them up as broadly as possible. But my first one here that I have listed is this idea that Jesus had been heavily criticizing both the Pharisees and Sadducees at this time. If you want to turn over to Matthew chapter 23. So this is the 7 woes to the scribes and the Pharisees. To the scribes and Pharisees, yeah. We're not going to look at the Sadducees, but he also has called out the Sadducees multiple times. I think we've all seen that throughout kind of the lessons here. But I'll start in verse 13 and just read a couple verses here. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, for you neither enter yourselves nor allow those who would enter to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte, and when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. So I'll relay this entire chapter. Chapter 23 itself is the 7 woes, so it would have been a rather long lesson, especially with Jesus talking, just specifically calling out the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. But we also see in just that little excerpt that I read there, just those 2 verses, his language is very strong. When you look kind of at Jesus' teachings and stuff, when he teaches, you don't think of him to be calling someone like a child of hell or anything. But with the Pharisees especially, I mean, he really did use strong language in order to rebuke them. So I think that's something interesting. Yeah, Daniel.
Yeah, not only that, I mean, because they should have known, you know, if anything, you know, they studied a lot.
Yeah.
So, you see the rebuke is
Yeah.
great.
Exactly. And so this would be something that they were probably not very familiar with at their time. I mean, they love that they're in the power, obviously, and I don't think people were going to be walking around necessarily to these priests and being like, oh, you're a horrible, awful person, you're going to hell. I don't think that would have been something they would have been used to, and that's definitely not something they would have appreciated about Jesus. And so my next point here is going to be Jesus was becoming very well known. We know that, and he was performing miracles. If you look at even working on the Sabbath, that's my next point, but I won't go into that yet. But he was performing miracles, and he was teaching and could not be outsmarted. So if we go to Matthew 22, verse 45, that's kind of right next to what we were just looking at here. This was ironically my last lesson. This was after he answers the greatest commandment, and then he kind of flipped the script on them and asked them a question. And it says, if then David calls him Lord, how is he the son? And no one was able to answer him, him a word, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. So that was kind of the turning point where we kind of learned of the intelligence of Jesus. It could not be questioned by any of them. And he was asking that question to a scribe, ironically, someone who was supposed to be kind of a master of the old law. And they could not outsmart him, and they could not trap him in any questions. So we're also past that point. They couldn't intellectually challenge him. That was another huge issue they had, which goes back to their authority, obviously. And then if we turn to Matthew, let's go to chapter 21, and then I'll start in verse 8. All right, and that reads, "This is the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And the crowds that went before him and that followed him were shouting, 'Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest.' And when he entered into Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, 'Who is this?' And the crowd said, 'This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee.'" So we already covered the story, obviously, where maybe they didn't know he was the Christ in this moment or anything. Maybe some of them did. But the intention of this verse was just to kind of introduce his popularity here. I mean, it says the whole entire city was stirred. You see these people kind of putting their cloaks down and their coats down for his entry. And this was into the city of Jerusalem. So this would have been, I'm sure, a well-known event throughout the city and to the chief priests and all of them, all the other priests and religious leaders that would have been possibly near the temple or around it. So I just put that in there because this is obviously a direct threat to their authority again, because if he's this popular and they're calling him a prophet, they're not going to be happy with that, especially since we know from the past that he's been calling them out. And then my next kind of point here was Jesus, I put it in parentheses, was claiming to be the Son of God, although he never actually directly tells them he was the Son of God. But also Jesus would break tradition, like working on the Sabbath. We know the story of how he healed the blind man. That obviously made them very mad. And then that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, that whole story. And then he ate with tax collectors and sinners. That was one of his earlier stories, but he would do that frequently, and that's not something they would have done, and that's something they would have frowned upon, and they did call him out for that multiple times. But if we turn to John chapter 4, and then we'll start in verse 25. This is going to be the first time that Jesus introduces himself as a Messiah. And it says, "The woman said to him, 'I know the Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things.' Jesus said to her, 'I speak to you, am he.'" So this was the first recorded instance of Jesus actually confessing himself as the Christ, and this was to the woman at the well. And I kind of mentioned how he doesn't actually use this and say this directly to the Jewish leaders or the Jews. But if we turn to Luke chapter 22, so back in your Bibles, but this will be technically forward in time, so I'm stealing from somebody. We'll go to Luke 22, and then in verse 70. Okay, so starting in verse 70. "So they all said, 'Are you the Son of God then?' And he said to them, 'You say that I am.' Then they said, 'What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips.'" So I just threw this in really quick. I won't go over it too much because this is going to be someone else's lesson here. But they were still accusing him of saying that he was the Christ, even though he didn't directly necessarily tell them. They still know he was associated with the Son of God, and he was saying that, and they're going to end up using that against him during his trials. So, and then that will essentially condemn him to death. But that kind of wraps up our context here. And this all really leads back to the point of that he was challenging the authority of the Sanhedrin at the time. They couldn't really control what he said. He was becoming super popular, like we talked about, performing miracles. And all of this would have taken away from their power at the time. And that's something that we know they would not have appreciated. They loved, as we read, they loved to be seen by the other people as being these righteous and holy people, the whitewashed tombs. So on the outward appearance, they look so holy. They look like they're doing everything right. But in reality, I mean, they are just disgusting in the inside, and they're turning people away from the actual truth of God because of their traditions. Yeah.
Just to help with the Sadducee side of it, in Matthew 22 and verse 29, it says, "Jesus answered and said to them, 'You are mistaken, not knowing the scriptures nor the power of God.'"
Yeah, exactly. And that was the Sadducees. Yep. Yeah, so there we go. There's an example. I mean, there's probably countless more but he calls out both parties equally. But he uses pretty strong language with them, and he rebukes them very openly. And then you even see when he cleanses the temple, stuff like that. I didn't add that all in, but of course we know that, and that was obviously some big points of contention between the two parties. So that's kind of where we are with right before he's going to be arrested. I feel like that's kind of the main points that I wanted to talk about before we go into that. But for now, we're going to go into Matthew chapter 26, and this is where my verses start here. So we'll go to Matthew chapter 26, and we'll be reading the first 5 verses here. All right, so starting in verse 1. When Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified." Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people." So in verse 1 and 2 here, we see this will be the last time Jesus is going to predict his death, obviously because it's right around the corner here. But he does this 4 total times, one in this chapter, and then he also does it in Matthew 16, 17, and 20. And those correlate with the other Gospels, but I didn't add those in. We won't look at them. But I just wanted to add that in because I think it's important. Because Jesus right here is pretty much plainly saying that his hour has come, and the entire reason for him coming down onto this earth is about to happen. And we're about to go into that, like I said. But it seems like he's pretty calm in this moment as he's telling his apostles this, but we know we haven't actually technically covered the prayer in the garden. But if we want to turn over to Luke 22 again. And then I will do verse 44. So this is during his prayer on the Mount of Olives. We're going to cover this in a later class, but this technically has happened already. And verse 44 reads, "And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground." And then the verse before that, the 2 verses before that, he asks if the Father is willing to pass this cup from him. So we see that although in this verse he seems ready, he's telling his apostles, like, the hour has come, my time has come. But we know that just before this, only a few moments, it says he was in agony, and then he was sweating drops of blood. And I did a little research on that just to be kind of just for fun. And that's actually, the medical term is hematidrosis. And that's the Greek word is hema, which is blood, and then drosis is sweat. And that's actually a real thing. It totally is possible. It's very rare. There was like a handful of cases reported. But it's actually when your body is in like such a active state, so your sympathetic nervous system is so strong that your heart rate and your blood pressure spikes so high that your blood vessels actually start to crack. And then when they crack, your blood can leak out into your sweat, and then you will literally be sweating like actual drops of blood. And so I can't even imagine, I get up here and my like blood pressure goes up, but I can't imagine what it would be like if you're sweating that bad that drops of blood are literally falling. And, you can feel your heart rate when it gets up to like certain points. You're working out or something. So I just can't even imagine the agony it's in. And it's an awful moment for Jesus, but it's also kind of a beautiful moment for us to read about because you can see the humanity of Christ here. He's in this physical body, and it's almost giving up on him because he knows what's about to come. If you imagine, I can't even imagine knowing the day I die, but if you imagine, he knows the exact day he's going to die, the exact way he's going to die, and then it's an awful, awful death. And he's just looking now, just moments before he's about to die, at what he's going to have to go through and how prolonged that's going to be. Not only from the physical side is he going to just suffer so much, but the emotional side. The apostles I'd call his close friends, they're all going to leave him. They're all going to ditch him. Peter's going to deny him. We looked at that already. He's pretty much going to be left at one point all alone, even from God. So you can obviously see what that would do to a person as he's kind of praying about that in the garden. And now he's overcome that. He's been strengthened, and he knows what he has to do. And it's just kind of an amazing thing that he can overcome that fear and still be ready to go and to die for all of us. But what a moment. But turning back to Matthew 26, this is also in verse 3. I wanted to introduce briefly Caiaphas. And he was the high priest, it says, at the time. And from my research, he was the high priest by the Roman selection. So that's interesting to note because his father-in-law was Annas, and he was the Jewish selected high priest. And it was said that at the time, obviously the Jews would have gone with his father-in-law more. They would have followed him as the real high priest. And I was trying to find some like biblical reference to that, and I found over in John 18. So if you want to go to John chapter 18, this is again a little bit ahead during his trials. So John 18, and then we'll be looking at verse 12. So this is when he's going to face both Annas and Caiaphas. And he's going to, in verse 12, it says, "So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First, they led him to Annas, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas." So I just think it's interesting to note, I can't say for certain that this is like backing up the historical evidence that they looked at Caiaphas kind of as second because he was Roman selected. But if they did this planning over in the courtyard of Caiaphas, it's interesting that they went and took Jesus first to his father-in-law. So I think that might have shown possibly the authority that the non-Roman selected high priest would have had. But it's obviously just gives us something kind of interesting to think about as he's going into these trials, that he has to face both of them, and that it was actually Caiaphas who he goes to second. I don't know if anybody has any comments or any other interesting background on that. That was just something I read and kind of like wanted to look at a little bit. But we'll go back to Matthew 26 now. Okay, and then the last thing I was going to bring up for the Matthew account is kind of where the meeting location is at. So Caiaphas' courtyard was located, from what I researched, at the eastern slope of Mount Zion. And then at this time we know that Jesus was over in Gethsemane. He had just done his prayer. So he would have been located at the base of the Mount of Olives. And I have a picture here. I'm going to see how blurry or not blurry it is. Okay, that doesn't look great. But I'm going to try and use a laser pointer. So this is where they would have been doing their meeting. Somewhere around here. This is the Kidron Valley. So you can't tell, but it goes down from this picture. And then here is the Mount of Olives, where Jesus would have been. And it's just interesting to note the proximity of how close they actually were. They say it's like about a Sabbath day's walk. I don't know how long that necessarily would have been. But it wasn't like a super far distance. And here you have, we know, 2 days before the Passover, Jesus would have been at the Mount Olives. And what's he doing? He's praying. He's kind of preparing his apostles for his last days and what's to come. And then he's, focusing on God and then what he's about to go through. And then on the other side, you have these Jewish leaders who 2 days before the Passover are probably supposed to be doing something related to the Passover feast, the celebration itself. But instead, they're actually planning on how to kill Christ, so God on earth. So it's just an interesting kind of point I wanted to bring up based on how close they were in proximity, but the differences they had, what they were focusing on at that time, and kind of what their plans were for the next few days. So we'll move on from here. I'm going to revisit this in a little bit, but we're going to move on to the Mark account now. My Mark section's a little bit chopped up. We'll read the first 2 verses, and then we'll skip the anointment and go to 10 and 11 because we've already covered that. All right, so Mark 14, and I'll read the first 2 verses here. "It was now 2 days before the Passover and the feast of the unleavened bread. And the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. For they said, 'Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people.'" This was the same in Matthew and Mark. They both agree on like the secrecy of what the Jewish leaders were doing and the chief priests. They're making sure to meet very secretly. I think it's by stealth, it says in this account. Mine is the New English Standard Version. But they're really focusing on not being caught here. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. One, they do not want an uproar from the people. They know his popularity, like we talked about. But I also think what they were doing, they knew was kind of wrong. I think they know they were going to put Jesus to death, and that was not the right thing to do, because if they really felt like that was an okay decision and they had the authority to do that, I don't think they would have minded if people would have known, because I think they would have hoped that everyone would be in agreement with them. But I think they kind of knew what they were doing is wrong. So like, okay, we need to make sure this is like very secretive, and we're doing this outside kind of where anyone else could be. That's why they're in the high priest's courtyard. So that's just something interesting. It talks about that in Matthew, Mark, and then also in Luke. They all agree how secretive this was, but it's just kind of interesting to note it. And then also, again, this sets the time frame, 2 days. We're 2 days before the Passover. So just keep that in mind as we continue on in the future for these next few lessons before his death, because that'll become very important, obviously, when he dies later. And then we'll move on from this point, and we're going to go to verses 10 and 11. And this is where we make the switch from, we've obviously seen the prediction, and we've seen the plot for his death, but now we're going to move into Judas and his decision here. So I'll read verses 10 and 11. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money, and he sought an opportunity to betray him. So I have a few points from this. Obviously, my first kind of initial thought when reading it was I'd always looked at Judas's betrayal as kind of like a two-party thing. Obviously, the chief priests wanted to kill Jesus, and then Judas kind of made that decision. I always thought it was because the chief priests like approached Judas in some way. I didn't know how, and we're like, hey, like we want Jesus dead. Like we'll give you X amount of dollars or whatever. And then like an exchange kind of went down. But this gives us kind of that clear image of what was Judas's own decision, really. It says he went and seeked out them. So they didn't come to him, or they didn't really have to convince him to do this necessarily. It was more like Judas made this decision that he wanted to turn in Jesus, and then he went and did it himself. So there was no like chief priest bribing him necessarily or bargaining per se. But then, of course, we know from Matthew 26, verses 15 and 16, it was for that 30 shekels of silver. Eric did a good class on this. We had like a discussion on what could have possibly been going on in Judas's mind. Because if you do like the translation that I looked up for 30 shekels of silver, what that would have been today, that's like $13, like not even. So for $13 to kill somebody, let alone Jesus, I mean, it just seems like, what could he possibly been thinking? I don't know if anybody has any thoughts. I know there's the thought that obviously maybe they thought, maybe he thought Jesus would never die. That's why he threw the money away and killed himself after. Maybe he just never really ever believed, and he actually did want him put in prison or killed. I don't really know. I still found nothing about what he was thinking in the moment on that. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts. Exactly. Yeah. No. Yeah. That greed. Yeah. Yeah. And then another interesting point about this is I'm going to have my dad read Zechariah chapter 11 and then verse 12. This was actually prophesied hundreds of years ago, the exact kind of dollar amount here. Chapter 11, verse 12.
And I said to them, if it's agreeable to you, give me my wages, and if not, refrain. So they weighed out my wages, 30 pieces of silver.
All right. So I'm not going to go too deep into this one because I feel like somebody a little bit better could explain it. But the gist of the story, the very short kind of summary would be that Zechariah was pretty upset here because at this time, 30 shekels of silver was about a slave, a wage for a slave. And this is the nation of Israel, or to buy a slave, right? The nation of Israel was basically saying Zechariah was worth that. And so he was super upset. But then, obviously, the irony of this is hundreds of years later, that's the exact same amount that Jesus will be betrayed for, and the exact amount that Israel, again, will place on Christ. So just kind of interesting to look at that hundreds of years before this even happened, you go back, you look, it's just incredible that they could call the exact dollar amount. There's, I think, over 300 plus total prophecies about Jesus and the Christ life, and every single one almost up to this point is being fulfilled. It's just amazing that that's written, how many years before. And then the last point about the 30 shekels of silver is, I don't know how money necessarily translated back then, but if you look even 100 years ago, what, $5 was worth versus now, Jesus was potentially worth significantly even less than back then. Yeah.
And it's interesting you stopped on verse 12 there, because verse 13 in Zechariah actually ties it closer to this event, more than 12, because it says, and the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, that princely price they set on me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord for the potter. And we know that's what happens later on.
Yeah.
He throws the money back to the Sanhedrin, saying, I can't do it. And they use it to buy the potter's field.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
that's how it ties even more to prophecy directly for this
Yeah.
we're talking about.
Exactly. That's what I was saying. It's such a loaded, this passage itself. You could do a whole thing on about how it connects to Jesus. You could do that with, honestly, a ton of different of the prophecies. You could probably do your own, multiple lessons on those and how they connect to what we've just been learning about. But thank you, it's obviously. But it's just amazing to look, obviously, back at some of these. Even Isaiah 53 I had mentioned in there. Obviously, we're getting to that point where he's going to start checking all the boxes off of that, how he was silent during his trials and stuff like that. Just truly amazing. Hundreds of years before they write this, and then here's Jesus now, and we're going to be going over that right now. But we'll go back to Mark here. And then my last kind of point on this was we can't say for certain what was going on in Judas's mind, but we know he had this sinful heart, and he's going to turn Jesus in. But I also don't know necessarily this. Obviously, we're kind of in the same time period here with verses 1 and 2 and 10 and 11, but I don't know the exact moment. I was trying to kind of maybe figure out when Judas actually went to the chief priest, because if we go back to this picture, it's a Sabbath day walk, whatever that meant, but I feel like that's a pretty good distance, so I don't think it was necessarily that Jesus said, okay, my hour's come, and then the chief priests were meeting during this time, and then Judas ran across and met them. I think this could have been maybe possibly a few moments before. Maybe it was after the Last Supper he left and went to them. I don't know the exact date, I couldn't tell you, but it's just something interesting to think about too, is maybe when Judas actually did go and meet the chief priests and have this deal done. That's just another thing that kind of came up. But we'll move on now to the Luke account, and like I said, we're going to do just verses 3 through 6, and that's going to be Luke 22, verses 3 through 6. Okay, so Luke 22, verse 3. Then Satan entered into Judas called Iscariot, who was one of the number of the 12. He went away and conferred with the chief priests and officers how he might betray him to them. And they were glad and agreed to give him money, so he consented and sought an opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of a crowd. So the first thing here, obviously, we get is the predestination. If you look anything up about this verse, a lot of people will be like, oh, this was predestined. Judas was always going to betray the Christ, and he was always kind of the devil, that's what they call him, and he was always kind of condemned to hell from the very start of his life. But I think if you read just, there's so many verses you could choose from. I have John 3:16 down here. But if you want to look at 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 16, that's a good one. We'll turn there really quick. Okay, so 1 Peter 2, chapter 16. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. So there's so many verses, obviously, on free will and choosing God in your life, that I feel like if you ever do run into an argument with someone who's actively trying to understand the Bible, if you just show them kind of these verses similar to this about like John 3:16, God sent his son for everyone, obviously, just stuff like that, I think you could really open up their mind to the fact that the real problem with Judas was not he was condemned to hell from the start of his life. He wasn't just necessarily made to betray Jesus. It was instead that he had this unfaithful heart. He had these sinful tendencies that we were talking about. And at the end of the day, he eventually got to a point where he had to he accepted his sin and temptation, and he allowed the devil to come into his heart. It's kind of like Pharaoh the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. We do lessons on that sometimes. It wasn't that God forced Judas into this. If you even look at Judas's life, I mean, how many times has he been told he's going to betray Jesus? He's lived with Jesus for all this time. He knows Jesus probably just as good as anyone would have. He knows that he needs to turn from his sin and to choose God in faithfulness, but he just couldn't overcome his sin at the end of the day. And Jesus and God is all-knowing. He was able to look into his heart, and he could see what he was going to do and what he was going to choose, but that wasn't him forcing Judas into making a decision here. He was given every chance he could, I think, to turn from his sinful nature, but at the end of the day, he consented to the devil, and he allowed him to enter in, and then that's when he made that decision to go and betray Jesus. So it was not that he was predestined. It's not a predestined argument. That's kind of the point I'm trying to make here. So turning back now, just finishing up here. So we're in verses 3 through 6. My last point that I kind of wanted to wrap up with was Although it wasn't a predestination thing, it's kind of a scary reminder of just how dangerous sin is. If you look at Judas, he would have been with Jesus for all of Jesus' ministries and all those days for years. He would have seen the entire life of Christ and how he lived. And then even seeing all that, he still was able to go and betray the Christ. So just interesting that how tempted we can be by the devil in our lives if even one of them could turn. And they all end up leaving the Christ anyway, obviously, during his death. But I think it's just kind of a stark reminder, a little bit of a scary reminder that we need to be focused on what we're learning about here today and about that life of Christ that he lived and what he wants us to do with our lives, because sin is real and it is very tempting, obviously, and it can cause a lot of problems. And even if you are close to God, if you just kind of have moments where you slip up, it's still an opportunity for Satan to kind of creep in and to affect your life in a negative way. And we can see that here. If one of the apostles can turn, so can all of us. So it's kind of a sad reminder at the end of my lesson here, but I'll just leave us with that. I don't know if anyone has any other comments or questions, concerns. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a really good point. And even leading to the part where Jesus goes to pray in the garden, and the disciples, they took with him as sleep. He said, "Look, watch and pray."
Yeah, and that was right before this. Yeah. Any other? Nothing else? All right, that's class.